Hello, it's another episode of Shadow Talk. Yes, it's that time again. In this week's episode, it's lock, stock, and rue smoking barrels as ransomware in the headlines again. We've got plummeting stock as a result of data breaches, and the Triton malware is attributed to Russian government entity. All this in this week's Shadow Talk. And joining me this week, we have got, as always, research and strategy analyst Rafael Amado. Hello, Raf.
Hey, Mike. It's a nice role reversal today. I get to sit back. You get to be the host.
Yeah, you get to provide all of the actual content in this one where I...
Yeah, to be honest, it's probably more work for me actually having to speak. You got the easy job.
I'm just keeping the ship steady. And also with us this week, we've got Harrison Van Riper. Hello, Harrison.
Hey, Mike. How's it going? Good to be back.
Lovely to have you back. I'm glad we've got both of you here to talk about the topics this week. In particular, the first story which I want to spend a good amount of time on is ransomware, which has hit the headlines significantly in this month.
Yeah, I'm going to have to maybe defer to Harrison on this one because for once, I don't know too much about what's going on in the ransomware scene. I've sort of missed the boat this month. Harrison, is it Gang Crab again? Let me guess. Keep it nautical.
Yeah, I mean, Game Crab is definitely involved, but I think, October was a big month for ransomware, specifically affecting smaller public entities, which was kind of the focus of the research for this week's intelligence summary. So kind of a shameless plug for all of our listeners to go and download and read that. But yeah, so like over the last 6 months or so, ransomware attacks have really ebbed and flowed, and October was definitely a peak month. It's not really clear why these attacks occur in waves like that, but it's definitely an interesting kind of point.
And is this, I'm interested, we constantly have occasionally a whole load of instances of ransomware reports. Is this an increase or just collection bias, do you reckon?
I don't necessarily think it's a collection bias. We see that the increase of incidents reported is different than the month before, and then the month before that, which is kind of why I like looking at the longer term view of kind of what's going on to data like this. I think the bigger trend is that these waves kind of go in waves, so it increases and decreases month to month. So that's kind of the main takeaway I think from this.
I guess the other thing is that a lot of these ransomware campaigns are just that. They're run as campaigns. So they will send out usually emails en masse at a particular time. So it's probably not a surprise that you have a high number of reports in a short period of time over like a week or a month, because that's when the campaign is at its height. That's what I would assume.
Exactly.
And I guess another piece to those campaigns is the targeting of specific sectors. And one thing that you see increasingly cropping up is specifically against government and public institutions. Is there a reason why we may see these targeted a little bit more than other sectors?
These government institutions and public sector organizations seemingly are more likely to be targeted due to the perception that they lack more established security controls. So, for instance, the city of Atlanta experienced a pretty hefty SamSam ransomware infection earlier this year in March. And then, in the following 6 months between April and October, the state of Georgia itself kind of all over experienced a higher concentration of ransomware attacks affecting those, smaller public institutions. So I think it's fair to say that attackers saw an opportunity from the pretty high-profile SamSam attack and decided to try and capitalize on that.
I'd add something to that as well. I think one of the reasons public institutions or government bodies, state authorities are also highly targeted is probably, well, what is the aim of a ransomware infection? It's to extort the victim. So if you're going to go for something like a transport authority or a state body, which is obviously very pivotal administrative body, or a transport body which is controlling the amount of trains or buses going through a particular city, that's the type of organization that can't actually afford to be offline for a long period of time. So as well as the perception of them maybe not having the best security controls, there's probably a perception that these are the type of targets where it's most crucial for them to get back up online and running as quick as possible. So perhaps these are the organizations that will pay up quicker or just pay up at all.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. I think, from the stuff that we were looking at over the last 6 months, there actually were relatively few that actually reported that they had paid the ransom. But even so, I still think that it's that perception, right? It's the perception that they will pay. So that's what's going to drive more attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, obviously, we've talked about Samsam. Raphael brought up GanCrab. I'm particularly interested which are the most popular variants at the moment. Have you done any research into that, Harrison?
Yeah, again, a part of the research that we were doing this week, GanCrab definitely popped up. BitPaymer was pretty popular, and then TrickBot, has been reported a lot recently. It's really GanCrab and TrickBot that get the headlines, though, it seems.
Yeah, for listeners not familiar with TrickBot, it's been traditionally a banking Trojan, which has looked to harvest log-on credentials of banking customers. But I think a couple of months ago, perhaps, it added some screen locking capability, and there have been some further updates this week with that particular functionality. So it's interesting to see that whipping up a bit of momentum.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, specifically with the screen locking functionality, a lot of people, this was reported earlier in the year, and there's been kind of various variants that have popped up that have this screen locking functionality. Initially, people thought that this might suggest that TrickBot was going to transition its functionality into more of a ransomware rather than a banking Trojan. But there really hasn't been any kind of reported attacks of ransomware from TrickBot. And actually, it seems that it's more acting as a password stealing function and just a part of that attack chain rather than, a whole new functionality.
Yeah. And obviously, they're all developing significantly in different variants. And GanCrab is definitely one that does develop and has different versions coming out. Which version are we on now, Harrison?
Yeah, so we're on version 4. So I think in July, it was reported that the 4th version of GanCrab was discovered. And, GanCrab has been reported a lot throughout this year. It's received several updates from the developers, and usually that tends to imply that, it's been pretty successful. You wouldn't continue updating a software if it wasn't successful. So yeah, it seems that that's the case.
What do you think about having a nail in the coffin of GanCrab with the news that there's been a decryptor released for GanCrab and allowing victims to decrypt their own files? Obviously, that's not going to mean the end of ransomware or even the end of GanCrab, but it's certainly a step forward. For those that perhaps are infected by different ransomware or are interested in how they may defend against it, have we got any nuggets of advice that we could offer?
Playbook. I'm channeling Rick Holland. He loves the idea of a playbook, and I completely agree with him. It's not just ransomware, but many different other types of attacks. You should have a playbook for your organization. In terms of ransomware, as well as doing the standard things of having backups and everything, you need to also have a play-by-play account or a checklist or a process for what you're going to do if you are unfortunate enough to have a ransomware infection. How will your incident response team manage? What will your SOC do? What will your security analysts do? Do you need a PR team to come out and say something? Do legal need to do anything? Do you have a process in place for actually paying the ransom if that's something that you want to do? Or do you have insurance? Do you know how to contact your provider? All these different types of questions are not questions you want to be asking yourself for the first time after a ransomware infection. You need to be thinking about them beforehand.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, to put it extremely simply, prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. I think that's obviously a very simplified way of saying it, but I think it does apply here.
All right. Thanks, chaps. On to the next story of the week, and that has been another data breach. This time it's Cathay Pacific, 9.4 million records exposed. Anybody else got breach fatigue? Does anybody care about this? Should we care?
Should we care? I mean, customers of the airline should probably care. I think in terms of, I understand what you mean in terms of breach fatigue. It's like every week we get a new news of a new breach. And I think it really depends on the type of data that's leaked or compromised. But generally, I would say, yes, you should care. And when we analyze breaches, one of the first things we look for is whether customer credentials or payment details have been exposed. I mean, if it's payment details, that's quite self-explanatory. It could be used for fraud. Credentials, it gives you access to account takeovers, especially if people are reusing passwords across accounts. Now, in this case with Cathay Pacific, they've said that no passwords or full loyalty profile information have been compromised. However, there's still a large amount of personal data being exposed. So you've got date of birth, passport numbers, identity card details. Now, these are all really, really valuable for identity fraud. You've also got exposed full names, nationality, contact details. And if you just think of the type of security questions you usually get asked, whether it's online or over the phone or in person, you have a lot of that info here already that you can bypass security checks with. So I think there's enough information there to perform different types of identity fraud.
Yeah, I'm curious what the actual trade in passport details is online. From what I've seen, it's mainly scans and things like that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, there's different types and formats of passport and identity information online. So you've got scans, like you said, so like a picture showing the passport details and the ID number, for example. They're relatively cheap. They're useful for fraudulent activities such as opening bank accounts under a new identity or a different identity, and I've seen them sold for as little as $10 to $20 a piece. And then the other side of the spectrum, you've actually got physical passports, which are of course harder to acquire. Now that can be a legitimate passport that's been stolen, and then there can also be forged ones as well. I've seen online the price range between 5,000 to 15,000, and certain passports are more valuable than other ones. I mean, Russian ones are widely available. The US ones, for example, are a lot more popular and in demand, but I'd say maybe a bit harder to come across.
Yeah, and I've seen kind of advice from Cathay Pacific about remediating this risk, and one thing that always comes up is enabling multi-factor authentication. So just another reminder for any consumers to go down that route. One thing that's interesting with this case is kind of how much of an impact this reported incident has had. 6.5% plunge in the share price, which I don't know how much that translates to, but I think that's a fair whack of money.
$320 million.
Hey, look at that.
It's a lot.
Rainman over here.
I mean, it is a lot, but then if you look at the Facebook share price, of course, since the announcement of that breach, that's slid by 13 billion. Obviously different size companies, but the takeaway is that these data breaches really do have an impact on the value of the company. So you should be taking it seriously. On that note,
sorry, Mike, carry on.
On that note, do we have any updates on the Facebook breach?
Well, we did have an announcement this week. So Facebook have actually been fined £500,000. So yeah, you talk about the share price plummeting and how that affects their overall value, but also they need to take into account the fines that come off their in terms of their profits at the end of the year as well. So Facebook fined £500,000, £500,000
wow,
by the UK Information Commissioner's Office, and yeah, that doesn't actually seem like a lot for Facebook, which is a multi-billion-pound company. Now, this is specifically about the Cambridge Analytica controversy, and I was looking into it, and the reason this fine is actually seemingly quite low is that this is actually the maximum fine allowed under the old data protection rules that applied before GDPR took effect in May. Now, what was interesting for me is that if you compare this to the Tesco breach, so Tesco, large UK retailer, they have actually been fined £23.4 million by the UK regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority. They got a discount, God knows why, which resulted in a 16.4 million fine. So Facebook 500,000, Tesco 16.4 million. So you can see the difference there. Now there's reasons for that. As I said, there's the whole GDPR effect in terms of the timings of things, but it's also in terms of what the ICO is able to fine people, and the FCA, which is a body that's been around for a long time, and it's probably got sharper teeth in this capacity, given that it's also looking at financial institutions as well. So I think going forward, we're going to see more cases where companies are going to have much heavier fines. And it would be interesting to know, had the Facebook breach or the announcement of it had come after GDPR took place, how much larger this fine would have actually been.
Yeah, I think in some cases, though, it's more of a statement in and of itself, having the announcement of that. And I think that can be a deterrence. Every little fine helps.
Yeah, it was also just funny that all this news came out quite nicely in terms of the timing. So this week is Cybersecurity Awareness Week. The theme is technology and privacy. And we had Tim Cook the other day in Brussels tell an audience, it's quite interesting that the Apple CEO will come out and criticize the way large technology companies abuse people's personal data. I mean, to quote him, he says, personal data is being weaponized with military efficiency against us. So data breaches, misuse of personal data is definitely the theme of the week. And Facebook, I guess you could call them one of the victims, if you can call them that at all.
Yeah, I'm going to just sidestep that issue of the privacy debate for this podcast, because
we'd devote a separate podcast or two for that. Don't worry, we don't have time for that today.
Pops hot potato on the table and moves on to the final story of the week, and that is news that the Triton or Trisis malware has been attributed to a Russian government entity. For those of you not familiar with Triton, which is also known as Trisis, depending on what vendor you speak to, this was a malware that's been targeting ICS, discovered in late 2017, specifically against an attack against a Saudi Arabian petrochemical company. Now, not going to go into it too much because we have covered it in a previous podcast and we're by no means experts in the ICS field, but there's I think a few interesting things to tease out of it. For those of you not familiar, Triton is a malware which, when it's installed on the ICS, the code actually looks for the existence of specific equipment, and if it can connect to that equipment, it then begins to inject new commands. If those commands cannot be accepted, then it can go about crashing the system, and that's what happened in this case and how it was discovered. Now, the news this week is that the doing some investigation into that, specifically found some test files which had been going since about 2014, testing against antivirus scanners. And FireEye were able to link some of that to some infrastructure based in Russia at their Russia Central Scientific Research Institute of Chemistry and Mechanics in a district of Moscow. Now, this is interesting because we kind of assumed at the time, because it was a Saudi Arabian target, everybody kind of was like, yeah, it's Iran. But actually, this research suggests that it was kind of Russia behind it. Now, where I'm going with all of this is, should we care based on, we thought it was Iran, is it Russia? Should we care about actually who is conducting these attacks? Or do we take a leaf out of Robert Lee's book and think, right, we should actually be focusing here on the TTPs rather than exactly who is attributed to the attack?
Yeah, I think, where attribution comes in handy is when you are kind of assessing the TTPs, right? So, looking at a nation state such as Iran, maybe not as technically advanced as Russia. But I think that a lot of times, attribution gets the main stage, but if you're a practitioner, you don't necessarily care about who did it. You more care about how you can stop it or prevent it. So focusing on how the attackers do what they do, learning their TTPs, staying current with new attack techniques. These are all things that people in InfoSec jobs usually focus on rather than just which country is responsible.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that a lot of the focus is still on IOCs within the threat intel space, and kind of it's always quite hard to encourage people and provide digestible ways to actually understand these TTPs. Now, I know if Rich Gold were on this podcast, he would be screaming MITRE ATT&CK to me. if anybody was interested in that, they have launched a new website, so I'd encourage listeners to check out that and have a look at all the different TTPs and the campaigns that they're referencing.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm definitely with Rich on that one. I love MITRE ATT&CK. I know, from my experience doing research for some of our clients, especially those who occupy those practitioner roles that I'm kind of, talking about, they ask for reports about why, how, where, and when these attacks happen much more often than the who.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important question and point to make out. Now, we are at the end of the podcast. I'm going to go to each of you and ask you for a key takeaway for the week. I'll go to you first, Raphael.
I know you said I can't talk about privacy, but I'm going to talk about privacy. You're going to let me finish though, right?
We'll see where it goes, yeah.
Right, as I said, privacy debate is complex. I won't go into it now. Maybe we can devote a future podcast to it if people want. But in spirit of today or this week's theme, I want to encourage listeners to think more about personal data. And we have spoken about it today, not just with Facebook, but also with the Cathay Pacific breach. And one significant thing here is, all right, we can talk about large organizations, tech organizations, how they misuse data. That's really important. Don't want to negate that. But what the Cathay Pacific breach shows is that every third party you use, every service you sign up to increases your attack surface. And you simply can't trust all these third parties to keep your data secure. So what do? You can't just abdicate responsibility. We as individuals, as organizations, need to also have some agency in terms of how we keep our data safe. So talking about the simple things that you can do as an individual, you can not share your passwords across accounts, you can lock down your personal accounts, you can use multi-factor authentication, you can be selective about what data you give to different companies and services, you can look at permissions before you install mobile apps. So that's for me. Just take this away with you, have a think about that, and maybe we can discuss it at a different point.
Okay. Thanks, Raf. And Harrison, what do you got? Some ransomware takeaways for us?
I was going to steal Rafa's points from earlier, but I think, kind of a key thing to have in place would be a data disaster recovery plan. So having that playbook, having that stuff in place before the attack actually happens, the best defenses are just that, defenses, and they're not 100%. So, obviously there can be something that goes wrong or something gets missed or something like that. And you want to have a plan in place to kind of mitigate against that. So, that's definitely what I would advocate.
Okay. Thank you, Harrison, and thank you both for joining. Have a lovely weekend. Enjoy any Halloween celebrations, and speak to you next week.